Hi everybody, this is Kelly with Let's Paint Art Lessons, and today we're going to be talking all about mixed media. Mixed media is one of my favorite art forms. I love it because it allows you to mix a lot of different materials together, and you're only limited by your imagination. For this project, we were inspired by an artist named Jean-Michel Basquiat, and he's very well known for his use of layers and bright colors. We're going to be using our apple barrel paints from our kit, as well as some materials that you have around the home, like napkins, tissue paper, and magazines. We're also going to be using one of my favorite products, which is Podge. It's great for decoupaging because it can act as a sealer as well as an adhesive. I'm so excited to get painting with you. Let's go! Let's cover the supplies you're going to need for your mixed media project. The first thing that we're going to be using are these apple barrel acrylic paint. We're going to be using a cobalt blue, a bright yellow, lime tree, white, black, petunia purple. We're also going to be using Mod Podge from the kit. It's wonderful because it acts as a glue, sealer, and finisher for all of your projects. We're going to be using this as a glue to adhere our paper to our surface. Speaking of surfaces, you want to make sure and cover the area that you're working to protect the wood of a table or a desk. While the apple barrel paint is wonderful for cleaning up, something like a piece of newspaper, wax paper, or a paper bag will really help you with cleanup. I also have a palette that I'm going to put my paint on. You could also use a paper plate, a piece of wax paper, or any other surface that you have at home that you don't care to get paint on. You're going to need scissors to help cut the paper that you're going to be collaging. I also have a cup of water to clean my brushes, and I've got some paper towels to help with keeping the brushes clean and dry. Speaking of brushes, our kit comes with a 10-piece set of brushes in different sizes. For this project, I've pulled out the 3/4 inch flat brush, a number 10 flat brush, and a number 1 round brush. The surface I'm going to be working on today is a piece of illustration board. Other surfaces that you could use at home are a piece of cardboard, a piece of paper, or a flat canvas panel. I've also gone to plaidonline.com/letspaint, and I've printed off the printables that have the lessons on them. With this, we have the supply list, we have a little bit about the artist that inspired the project, and we have 2 examples of projects that you could create. With this, we also have included a color wheel as well as a suggested palette for each of the projects. My favorite part of the printables are these fun pattern papers. We have 4 different varieties with different patterns that you can choose from for your mixed media. Other things that you could use to bring some color into your mixed media project are tissue paper or wrapping paper, construction paper, paper party napkins, which I'm going to be using, or different pages for magazines. Now that you know what you need to get started on your project, I'm going to pour my palette out and then we'll get crafting. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start preparing the background for my mixed media piece. I have these pattern papers that I printed from the plaidonline.com/letspaint, and I'm going to be using these to create some interest in my background as my first layer. So I'm going to actually just tear them with my hands. And I'm going to tear them into strips. And I want them to be somewhat irregular, with some areas that are skinny and some areas that are a little thicker. Another option that would be good to use in your background if you have junk mail or newspapers at home, those are always good surfaces to start with. And I want to get some from each page just to have a little variety. To help it become a little bit more irregular, not such straight tears, I wiggle my hand back and forth a little bit. That just makes the shapes more interesting. Now that I have several strips of paper torn, I'm going to use the Mod Podge and adhere those to the surface. I'm going to put the Mod Podge into my palette. When I pour it into the palette, you notice that it's white and milky, but that's okay. It's going to dry perfectly clear. And again, this acts as glue as well as a finisher and sealer. Next, I'm going to take my 3/4 inch paintbrush and I'm going to dip it into the Mod Podge, and I'm going to start painting that onto the back of my ripped pieces of paper. I'm going to place the pieces of paper onto the surface. If anything sticks up, you can just take your brush and put a little under there and lay the paper down flat. With this, I'm going to put some of the strips on vertically, some on horizontally, and I want to have a variety to the patterns that I use. This just adds a little bit more visual interest. There's no right or wrong way to put your papers onto your background. As long as they're spread throughout, you can put them on any way that you want to and in any order that you'd like. So what I want to do next is I want to start adding some paint into the background, into the negative spaces. The negative spaces are where I don't have the pattern paper. So I've got my cobalt blue apple barrel paint, and I'm just going to brush that in. In some areas I'm going to have it thicker, and in some areas I'm going to leave it a little streaky, because it gives it a little bit more texture and a little bit more interest. Now that I've painted on the blue, I want to go ahead and add in some other colors. And even if the blue is wet, it's totally fine because those colors just mix together on the surface and makes it a little bit more interesting. So I've decided to use these cooler colors and a little bit of yellow just for some contrast, but feel free to use whatever colors you like. In that apple barrel kit, there's 23 colors of paint. So you could pick your favorite colors. If you want to make this for your room, you could pick something to match your decor. If you're making this for a gift, think about what their favorite color is. If you're having trouble to decide what colors to use, you can always look at your color wheel that's included in each of the printables. That can guide the colors that you select, because something like a primary color scheme would be great, a secondary color. You could do colors that are next to each other with an analogous color scheme, really whichever ones you prefer. Also, you could use the materials that you're using for collaging from home as inspiration for your palette. If you find a wrapping paper that you love, or a napkin that you love, or a magazine page, go ahead and pull from that and match your apple barrel paint to those colors. I think I want to pull a little bit of purple into my background. So I'm going to get the petunia purple and just paint some of those empty spaces. So this was the first mixed media piece that I made, and this one is definitely in the style of that, but I didn't pull purple into this, and you don't feel like you need to copy this exactly what I'm doing. Make it your own. So just like in collage where we layer papers, I'm layering the paint and I'm letting the colors show through. So in this area, I've got blue and purple and green, and they've all been painted over each other, but the dry brush technique lets the colors show through. The dry brush technique is when your brush isn't saturated in paint and you don't get a completely opaque stroke, so you can see through the patterns and you can see through the other layers of paint. Let me show you a close-up of the dry brush technique. So first I'm going to start with some blue, and I'm going to paint until it starts letting the paper show through. So this is a dry brush. It's not as saturated with paint as when I started. I'm going to then switch colors to the green. I'm going to paint the other direction. You could paint the same, but it just gives it a little bit more variety to go over it in the other direction. And you can see in some areas, the colors start to mix with one another to form a blue-green. And then in others, you can still see the blue underneath. And that just adds an extra layer of interest to your artwork. And I'm going to add some purple now. So with this technique, it doesn't take a lot of paint. As a matter of fact, if you get a lot on your brush, you can wipe it off on your paper towel. When I'm making art, I like to have a couple of pieces of scrap paper nearby. That lets me practice my techniques before I put them on my actual art piece. So the next step, we're going to begin adding some flowers to our background. And I'm going to show you a quick way to do that that's a little bit easier. I'm going to grab another piece of scrap paper and a pencil. And I'm going to draw a petal shape. So a petal shape is going to be rounded at the end, and it's going to taper into a point. I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut that shape out. You could make several of these and create different size flowers. Some could be thinner, some could be thicker, some could be smaller or larger. And they're going to act as a pattern when we make our petals. Next, I'm going to get some napkins. Okay, I'm going to grab some napkins, and this is what I'm going to use to make my flowers. So the napkins have a couple of layers to them, and I want to go ahead and separate those layers. It's a little easier if you go from the corner. And what that's going to do is make my layers more transparent so that when I adhere them to the surface, some of my background will show through. Once I've separated the layers, I'm going to fold my napkin back up, and I'm going to lay my pattern on top. Take my scissors, and I'm going to cut out from the napkin petals. So since I've folded my napkin back up, I've made 4 petals instead of 1. I'm just going to lay those out. Grab some more napkins. So if you wanted to use a different subject for your collage, you definitely could. You could use hearts, you could use stars, leaves. For the other example that I made, I used a face. So really, you're only limited by your imagination. So I'm going to use my petal template again. I folded my napkin back up. I chose napkins that have some reds and pinks in them just to give it a little bit of contrast from the background. I want them really to stand out. These are napkins that I had that had been collected from different celebrations and holidays. If you have a special event or a birthday party, something that was meaningful to you, that would be a great way to incorporate those napkins into a work of art. Petal template is really coming in handy to make sure that I have a good size and a good shape for each of the petals. This napkin was larger, so when I folded it back up, I'm actually getting more than 4 petals this time. My workspace is starting to get a little bit crowded, so I'm just going to go ahead and clean up. Got 2 more napkins, so I'm going to make some more petals. Now I have a variety of different colors and patterns of petals to work with. I'm going to move them over to the side so that I can begin composing where I'm going to put them on my background. I'm going to use my 3/4 inch brush again, so I'm going to make sure that that's clean from paint and dry it off on my paper towel. The first thing that I want to do before I begin gluing anything down, I want to lay out my petals into flower shapes. And I want to do this prior to gluing them down just to make sure that I have everything where I want it. I like to mix up the patterns and colors for the petals just to give it a little bit more of a fun look. I also want for my flowers to be at different heights so that I get some eye movement happening in the artwork. If they're all at the same level, then your eyes tend to stick in that one spot. So it just makes it a little bit more interesting to have them at different levels. Again, if they run off the page, that's totally fine too. We can always trim those off at the end. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that composition because I have one that's higher, one that is a little bit lower, and then one near the bottom of my page. Actually, I'm going to raise this one up just to give it a little bit more variety. And again, you can move yours around to put them wherever you like for them to be. The same thing if you're not using flowers, if you're using other shapes, just make sure that you have them at different levels throughout your composition. All right, I have some leftover petals, so later if I want to make another piece of art, I'll have those ready to go. I'm going to take my Mod Podge and I'm going to put more of that onto my palette. And I'm going to take my 3/4 inch flat paintbrush and I'm going to begin painting that onto the back of each of my petals. Again, it looks milky and white right now, but it's going to dry clear. The paper for the napkins is super thin. And so if it gets some wrinkles in it, that's okay. That's just texture and it gives it that handmade look. And having texture is really a great part of mixed media work. Sometimes if they start sticking to my fingers, I'll just take my brush and brush over the petals. That helps them adhere a little bit better. And because the Mod Podge dries clear, you're still going to get a nice clean look. I love how with some of the different petals, you can see the background through the layers. Mixed media is such a great form of art because it really does allow you to use whatever you have on hand to create something new. It's also very eco-friendly because you're upcycling, so things like junk mail or old school papers, letters, those are really great resources that you can use for collage. So that one wrinkled. Again, don't worry about if they get wrinkly. That just gives it some added texture, some added interest. So Mod Podge is really great to use with this because it acts as a glue and a sealer as well as a finish. So any kind of scrapbooking projects that you might be doing, other paper crafts, projects for school, it's wonderful to use for that because it does dry clear and it's very easy to use. You could also use this technique on a smaller scale and make cards or postcards. Okay, now that I have all of my petals glued down, I want to clean off my brush again, get the Mod Podge out of it.
And if you could move the Mod Podge.
Dry off my brush. The next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to use some paint and I'm going to highlight some of my flowers to make them stand out a little bit more, and I'm also going to add some stems and some petals. I'm going to switch to my number 10 brush and I'm going to use some green paint. This is the Apple Barrel Lime Tree acrylic paint. And I'm just going to draw some stems down, run them off the end or the edge of the paper. And I'm going to do that from the center point of my flowers. And I'm okay if some of the stems overlap a flower because that's what would happen in nature or in a bouquet. When you overlap the stems, it really gives it a layered effect, helps create depth, and it gives you the illusion of space. With the same green, every once in a while on my stem, I'm going to paint a leaf shape. So the leaf shape is a lot like the shape that you drew for your petals. So if you wanted to, you could create another pattern on a scrap piece of paper, or you could just go ahead and freehand your petals or your leaves. With the petals, I'm overlapping some of my flowers as well. Again, just to create some depth. So I'm using this small cup of water to clean my brushes. Depending on how much paint you're using in Mod Podge, you may need to switch your water out for fresh if it starts getting too murky. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a center for each of my flowers. So I'm going to use some yellow and I'm just going to paint a circle in each one of the flowers. We want this to be pretty free, so if it's not exactly even, that's perfect because in nature nothing is exactly even either. I love how that yellow pops against those warm colors that I used in the flowers. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to my small number 1 liner brush. This is going to be used for some details. For my details, I want to use some black paint and I want to make some veins on my leaves. So I'm going to do a line in the middle of each of them. And then I'm going to paint some diagonal lines coming from that center. I want my petals to pop out a little bit more. Right now they're getting a little bit lost. And so with that black paint, I want to do the same thing, and I'm kind of following the contours of the petal and putting in just a little bit of a black line. It can be broken. It doesn't have to go all the way around. It can change in thickness. Parts of your line can be thick, parts can be thin, and you don't even have to hit every single petal. Again, we're just trying to clarify some of the areas a little bit more and make them pop out. Some of your strokes might be a little bit more transparent and with the dry brush technique, and some of them might be a little bit more opaque, and that is fine. I think I want to go ahead and do a little bit on my stems too, so that they don't get lost. That's really starting to get the flowers to pop out. So I'm cleaning my brush off, drying it off, and then I'm going to get some white onto my brush, the same brush, that #1 liner, and I'm going to use the white and I'm going to put some highlights onto my petals and my flowers. And these can be any kind of lines you want. If you want to make the V-shaped lines, or if you just want to use straight lines, if you want to get some of the contours or the shape of the flowers. So really whatever kind of lines you feel like best bring out the shape of the leaves. I want to do the same thing on my flowers. So I'm going to take some white and just pop that into the center in some areas. And I'm going to do the same on each of my petals. So with mixed media, we're all about layers. So the more you add, the more interesting it becomes. Okay, I'm going to clean my brush off. Actually, let's do a little bit on the stems. All right, now I'm going to clean my brush off. And I'm going to give it one last look. See if there's anything else I want to add. I think I like it just the way that it is. I had so much fun making these mixed media pieces. These are a couple that I made, and I hope that you learned some techniques that you can incorporate into your own artwork. Remember that you can use any colors that you like, any subject matter that you like, or any materials that you have laying around the house. The possibilities are endless. For more information and inspiration, go to plaidonline.com/letspaint.